Hey, deserving listeners, as y'all know, over the years, y'all have asked me to talk about various different issues regarding murder and mass shootings and serial killers and psychopathy. We've discussed it from a number of different angles. We've discussed different events. We've discussed different diagnoses. We've discussed different ways of treating these individuals potentially. One of the things that will come up occasionally is the trend of mass shootings that's been happening over the past decade, and it seems to be on the rise, and how do we prevent that from happening? What are we doing to encourage it to continue? So I thought I would have Mark Follman on the podcast right now. He's an author and an expert on how to prevent and reduce mass shootings. Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thanks for having me on.
Tell us about your book.
Yeah, so the book is called Trigger Points, Inside the Mission to Stop Mass Shootings in America. It's coming out April 5th from HarperCollins. Very excited about it. I've worked on it for a number of years now. It's rooted in work I've done investigating this problem of mass shootings for Mother Jones, where I'm an editor and writer. I began really focusing quite a bit on mass shootings almost a decade ago now. In 2012, after the movie theater massacre that took place in Aurora, Colorado. There were several more that fall. And then, of course, Sandy Hook in December of that year was a real watershed event with this problem. And I had begun building a database of mass shootings because when I looked into it, I was startled to find that there weren't really good sets of data on this problem publicly available. So I started collecting it and doing some further reporting. And I began in the course of that work to learn about the field of threat assessment, behavioral threat detection, and the efforts that have been going on for quite a long time, actually, mostly behind the scenes to prevent planned violence. And that's the nature of this problem. These are planned attacks. We can get into talking more about the kind of mythology around the problem of mass shootings. But one of the main ones is that all the people who do this are insane and that they just snap and kind of go off the handle at the last minute. And that's a huge myth that almost all of these cases are subject to a long period of thinking and planning toward the event. So as I learned more about these efforts to stop these attacks and how the research has been developed into doing that, it occurred to me that there was a great opportunity to write a book about it. This is something that most of the general public has not known about, and even to this day still doesn't know about.
In your research, why do we have a problem with this?
Well, the question of the growth of the problem, there are several interesting questions around it. And one of the issues with trying to understand that or to track it has to do with how we define the problem. And there are a lot of sort of different ideas about how to define a, quote, mass shooting, unquote. The way that I looked at it was to really try to zero in conservatively in terms of a set of criteria to look at these types of attacks that are very high profile in public places where a lot of people typically are injured or killed, in which the motive, the question of why this happened is often very hard to answer. So that in that approach, it's setting aside what we would consider, I think, more sort of conventional explanations of gun crimes, whether they're related to robbery or gang violence or personal beefs that people have, anything like that, where you can explain why they happen. In other words, to try to explain why does someone walk into a movie theater and shoot a whole bunch of people and then get arrested? Or why do people go into a school and shoot the place up and then either die, commit suicide, or be apprehended by authorities?
Yeah, that's interesting because there's a Venn diagram there. There are some people that would fit that criteria, that, indiscriminate killing of people that they don't particularly have a beef with. But then there are some school shootings where the perpetrator does have a beef because they've been bullied or mistreated, or they feel harmed in some way socially, and will kill not only the person that they want to kill, but also other people around that just happen to be in the hallway. So there's kind of an overlap there in some cases, right?
That's right. And when you look into these cases more deeply, find with a lot of them that the thought process in the perpetrator has developed from, in many cases, from a specific identification of someone that they're targeting into a broader sense of grievance, targeting a group or an institution, a school or a workplace, whatever they've sort of developed as their idea of who or what they want to go after, that becomes broader or more abstract. And that's part of a behavioral process that the field of threat assessment looks at in trying to gauge warning signs and gauge the level of danger in a threat case. When someone's developing that violent ideation and it's progressing in that way, it's often a more urgent warning sign. So when we see these mass attacks, in many cases, that's where that process has gone at that point.
Why has it been on the rise over the past 10, 20 years?
Yeah, well, and as you suggest, there are many cases where a lot of people may be injured, but you may have fewer deaths, and those tend to not make the news as much. I think, the question of trend is important, and it's an interesting one, but I also think people get a little bit bogged down in it too. Yes, these have increased over the past decade. But even setting aside that debate, I think we can all agree that we have a lot of these, and we have way too many of these, and it's a serious problem in our country. So what is it that is causing that or continuing that? And I think, it's a big, complex question. One of the things I tried to do with Trigger Points was to really kind of step back and look at some of the bigger cultural forces in play and the kind of historical development of the problem. These kinds of targeted attacks and mass attacks have existed for a long, long time. But the fact that they're escalating now is interesting. They're escalating in terms of public attention, in terms of the scope. They're more lethal. I mean, we've had major attacks in the last few years where many more people are killed. If you think about the Las Vegas Strip in 2017, you think about the Orlando nightclub, Aurora, the movie theater massacre I mentioned. So those kinds of cases are more recent phenomenon as well. It's not an easy question to answer. There's, for decades, there's been blame pointed at violent entertainment, at the role of media, which is something that I get into quite a bit in the book. I did come to conclude with my reporting and research that the role of digital media has had an impact on this problem, exacerbating further the sense of sensationalism around this problem and what's known as the copycat effect, where you have plotters and attackers who emulate previous cases of mass shootings. So there's a whole mix of kind of broader cultural forces that are playing into this, and I do explore those at some length in the book.
Yeah. To me, it seems it's hard to know why you could consider it a trend, why any sort of trend would happen among human behavior. To me, it seems that there are an increasing amount of people who are lonely and demoralized and disconnected. You've always had people who were suicidal, wanted to kill themselves, and you've always had people who were suicidal who wanted to get back at society to some extent. A small percentage of people who were suicidal want to get revenge. But in more recent times, there's a few factors that I think play into this. You mentioned social media and the news. The ability to be able to post a manifesto and have everyone pour over it, including the news media, it's all over the internet, and other lonely people, maybe other lonely men who can relate, the Elliot Rodger situation where people almost, think of him as a hero to some extent.
Yeah.
And then when those kinds of things happen, obviously the copycat rate increases. And so, there's this feeling of just like, well, I'm going to die. Because I feel like this is something they don't really emphasize enough of, is that, they call these mass shooters like these heinous acts, and they are. But they, I think, leave out the fact that a good portion of the motivation might have been suicide and one last act of revenge on society or people, or one last act of, well, I'm going to go out with a bang. I want to be known for, I've always wanted some recognition, some acknowledgement of that I exist. And so what better way, or there's no other way to do it. And so if I do this, there's a chance that my manifesto will be poured over. I'll become famous for a little bit of time. A lot of people will do a lot of things to become famous. on social media these days. And so to me that, and then of course the copycatting really starts to kick in, and then our attention as media to individuals, we plaster their name and we pour over their manifesto. And of course there are guidelines now to not do that in the media because it's known that it will perpetuate the copycatting.
Right. That's something that's changed in more recent times. That was actually a focus for me years ago for some of my reporting, was the effect that was having, and starting to advocate as well for, hey, we should be doing this a little differently in this business, that it's meaningful to do it a different way.
Yeah, me as well. Because in the beginning of this podcast, I would do what I wasn't supposed to be doing because it was what people wanted me to talk about. It was interesting, but over time I discovered, I was like, well, I think I'm actually playing into this. I'm actually a part of the problem. And so I stopped doing that sort of thing. And then of course the prevalence of all the guns and all the bullets and, banana clips full of rounds. But it's not like without that, you can't do it. And then of course the cultural aspect of the United States, of just our value on revenge and independence and violence, and I'm going to show you. I don't know. I think we just have a culture that we teach young kids around standing up for yourself. And of course, that's a good thing, but it can become twisted when you're demoralized and suicidal and angry and rageful.
Well, I think you touched on something important here that I try to get at quite a lot in trigger points about the way that we see this problem now is different. As you suggested earlier, this has always been around loneliness and alienation and a desire for a small subset of people to have revenge or go out with a bang, but also to get attention, right? To be known, people who are desperate to be known and understood. And the capability to do that now is very different than it once was, right? And that has had a very clear material impact on this problem. Some of the leaders in the behavioral threat assessment field that I talked to about this had some really interesting things to say in terms of their concerns about the way in which people who are vulnerable to this type of thinking, and particularly young people, so comes up especially with school shootings, where you have this effect, this concern that there has been a growing effect in recent years, this idea that you could commit a violent attack, commit a school shooting, commit a mass shooting in a shopping mall or in a movie theater, will get you sensational attention, will make you notorious. Of course it will. I mean, that's a rational thought to have about doing this, because that is what we've seen demonstrated over and over in the culture and in the media. So there has been growing concern among threat assessment professionals who research these behaviors that thinking has become more validated in some ways, that it's seen as a more valid solution to one's grievances or despair or rage, right? And so it does raise some interesting questions about how we talk about this problem, how we cover this problem in the news media, that it does matter. And it's an interesting balance to try to deal with that. I've thought about it a lot over my years of work on this subject, and my thinking has evolved in some ways. There was a movement, as you probably recall, years ago now, to never name or identify a mass shooter, to try to completely have a complete media blackout. Well, of course, that's not realistic, but furthermore, that's actually counterproductive in my view, because we need to look at these cases forensically. We need to understand what's happening with them in order to be able to figure out the nature of the problem. And it's in the public interest to convey that. So, and yet we also need to ask the question, well, how do we do that in ways that isn't sensationalizing the story or the attention in a way that these perpetrators want? And there's a lot of evidence and a lot of case evidence showing that people who think about and then carry out these attacks are very cognizant of how they will be perceived by the media and on social media. And their goal is to be seen that way, to post tough guy photos of themselves with guns on Instagram or Facebook, knowing that those will be circulated widely around the world instantaneously, which is really the reality of it now, or to post a long manifesto, as you alluded to earlier, and have their grievances aired for the public far and wide. So we really have to think about how do we balance these kind of competing forces with, in the age of digital and social media.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you mentioned earlier the myth of mental illness and someone snapping.
Yep.
The thing that I always will tell people is that 99.999% of people who have schizophrenia, or 99.999% of people who have major depressive disorder and are suicidal, do not kill anyone. So This idea that you could attribute their behavior to some mental illness is absurd.
And it's not just that's that's useless as a predictive factor, right? Statistically, but it's also it's counterproductive, because if you assume that that's what a mass shooter should have, you may be looking in the wrong place.
Right.
And it's also stigmatizing, right, for all the people who aren't violent, who suffer from those afflictions. So
yeah, and it's a massive misunderstanding of what mental illness or conditions or disorders are.
Right.
And that an unawareness of the fact that a third of Americans they qualify for a mental illness. So it's like, it's a meaningless thing. It's just like saying anyway, point is that it's all that silliness. And I think that you said something that was interesting, that these people want to be understood. And I just wonder if we could go back in time and experiment and actually try to reach out to these individuals to help them to feel understood, so that they don't have to take such a drastic action to be understood. Then I wonder if we could prevent that. Is that part of what you try to get at?
Absolutely. I mean, that is a key component of the threat assessment work and threat management. When a person is causing concern about, thinking about or planning violence or acting in ways that are making people fearful that may happen. In many of these cases, this is the heart of the work, is intervening in constructive ways to try to help people who need help. It's really sort of a twin goal with this process. It's to head off potential violence, people who are signaling ways in which they may be headed for an attack, but then also getting help to these people who, in many cases, need real help, to be, understand the sort of root cause of their thinking or their grievance or their circumstances. One of the ways that I frame this in the book is that so often after mass shootings, the natural question for the general public is, why did the person do this? What's the motive? And that's often really hard to answer in these cases. It's complicated. But really, what threat assessment work tries to do, in a way, is study more the how of what they did. I mean, the process of the thinking that leads up to an attack is important, but then also looking at, well, what behaviors were underway? What were the circumstances for this person? What was going on in their life that was leading them down this, what they call the pathway to violence? Did they lose their job? Are they going through a divorce? Are they failing out of school? Are there substance abuse problems? What may be happening in their life in the near term that would set them off?
Which I have to say is identical for suicide risk assessment.
Well, and that's important here too, because suicide risk comes up in many cases. There's a very strong behavioral factor in threat cases where, one of the early findings I came across with my work, with the database work that I mentioned earlier on mass shootings, was discovering that more than half of all public mass shooting cases that I was studying ended in suicide. And that includes what's known as suicide by cop, right? Where the perpetrator goes into the event knowing that they're likely to die in a shootout with law enforcement, that's how they want it to end, if they're not shooting themselves with the weapon at the point of near apprehension. Yes, suicide as a risk factor is very important as part of the kind of matrix of behavioral warning signs that practitioners look at.
Yeah. Some people might ask, well, why is it always so often men and not women?
It's a good question. There are some women who come up in the context of this problem. There have been female mass shooters. Not many, though. It's the vast majority are men. I think that discussion tends to go toward gender politics and gun ownership and those kinds of areas. In a way, I think the field of threat assessment doesn't concern itself so much with that, at least not what I've seen in my work. And I think that's because gender is in no way a helpful predictive factor either, of course, right? I mean, roughly half the population is male and the other half female. So that doesn't really tell you anything about who may go commit an attack like this. On the other hand, the fact that it's almost all men who do it, that's not inconsequential, right? But I would defer to the more expert folks in psychology or in cultural studies to answer that question. I think certainly it does relate in some ways to the cultural things we were talking about earlier, with the way that violence is portrayed and seen as a possible act of aggression, valid aggression or vengeance or revenge. Perhaps that's a more male inclination, but that's a very broad contour of the problem, and as is access to firearms. I mean, that's just a given from the perspective of this field, right? That most threat assessment practitioners that I have talked to over the years just assume that anyone in a threat case may have access to a gun. That's just what they have to contend with in gauging the danger. And that's often an early question in the process of gauging a threat and the level of danger. So that is just part of our cultural and societal backdrop that we have to deal with in thinking about, how can we go about preventing this problem?
The first thing that I'll hear from people in my circle is assault weapons and getting rid of them to reduce the prevalence of mass shooting. What do you write about that, or what do you think about that in your book?
So I say at the very beginning of the book that really Trigger Points is not a book about guns. It's not a book about gun laws. That is subject matter that I have covered at length in my role as a journalist over the years. And it's obviously it's an important issue, but really the book is focused on behavior, human behavior, right? And looking at the problem through that lens and what can be done about it through that lens. So I don't really take on the question of, gun regulations per se in the book. It does come up in certain specific contexts. There are some specific laws that have, I think, particular relevance to threat management work. One example would be this more recent type of law known as a red flag law, where you have, or it's also called an extreme risk protection order. I think they're now in about 19 or 20 states, and they allow families of concerning individuals to petition a court to temporarily take away firearms from someone who they think may be at risk for harm to themselves or others. There's already some really good initial research showing its effectiveness, especially with preventing suicide. So, a gun law like that is pertinent to this field. But the notion of banning assault weapons or getting rid of all guns, or those kinds of arguments that we're so familiar with, I don't really take on in the book. And I would say, too, that really the genesis of this book for me in some ways was feeling early on the kind of frustration that I think many people feel about the gun debate politically, regardless of which side of that issue you're on, that we're stuck in the same arguments over and over, right? And for me, the question as an investigative journalist became, well, what more can we do about this? If we're going to continue to have the same arguments over and over, and also if we accept the fact that we are a country that's full of guns, there are nearly 400 million of them now in the United States. It's more than one for every man, woman, and child in the country. If we accept all that, then the question really becomes, what else? What else can we do? And I see threat assessment and the focus of the book is really about an additive solution that goes beyond the debate over gun laws. In the work that I've done about gun laws, better, more effective regulation of weapons, there's no doubt. I mean, research shows very clearly that better regulation of guns in a state context correlates with lesser gun violence. But unless and until we have a national landscape that is uniform in that way, we can't change it broadly, I guess I would say. I mean, you could ban assault weapons in California, but if you can go next door to Nevada and get them, you really aren't accomplishing a whole lot, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about how can we continue to build out a system of community-based prevention work that brings together expertise in mental health, in law enforcement, in education, in administration of companies or institutions, and have people work together to, as you say, recognize better what the warning signs are of this problem, and intervene constructively. And that's really what threat assessment work is, right? It's asking questions about a concerning situation or person. What is it about this person or situation that has us worried, and what should we do about it? And gathering information and looking more deeply and trying to resolve it constructively. It's a prevention method, right? It's not intended to be predictive. There's no way to predict who's going to commit a mass shooting. Nor is it intended to be punitive. You're not trying to lock someone up and throw away the key, or just kick them out and tell them to leave and never come back. The field's research shows very clearly that doesn't work. And often it's dangerous because people will come back. So you're talking about people who in many cases have not committed crime. So it's not a prosecutorial strategy. It's a preventative strategy. It's an intervention strategy. And I think, for me, I concluded long ago in my work as a journalist on the issue of gun violence that the reality of the landscape, as you're describing, of guns and gun violence in America demands something bigger and broader. I say at the outset of Trigger Points that the scope of the mass shootings problem is bigger than its tool of destruction. It's important to address effective gun laws, and it's important to think about the role of guns. Obviously, that's inherent to the problem, but it's bigger than that too. This is complicated human behavior, complicated cultural and societal situations, and we need to look at that too. And we need to ask, what more can we do to understand what's happening around this person, around this problem, right, and get in the way of it.
So if you were to talk with a teacher, what advice would you give them regarding threat assessment?
Well, the way that this tends to work in a school system or in a company or institution is setting up some leadership, primarily with people you already have in place who play those roles. So in the setting of a school, you'd have administrators who are in charge of not just running education, but also safety and security and those other elements of a school system. You have school psychologists and counselors who would have the mental health expertise, who are the ones you would look to train specifically on warning behaviors and the process of threat assessment that uses a set of protocols, a set of questions you would ask about a situation or an individual. And when you get down to the teacher level, I think you'd be talking about a more sort of basic understanding, training of, hey, we have this system, this team now set up in our school system, and if you see something that worries you, you let us know about it. We'll advise you on what to do. A significant part of Trigger Points, I spent time for about a year in a program, a threat assessment program in Oregon, in Salem Kaiser School District in Salem. And they were one of the pioneers of this after Columbine. They have a really robust program there. And they have a centralized team. It's a large public school district in Oregon. I think it's around 42,000 students. And they have a centralized team that works with people in each school building, training them on the basics, being there as a resource for them in cases where there's elevated concern. But often you're talking about situations in classrooms and in schools that are much more sort of garden variety disruption or concern, right? Kids fighting, or a kid acting out in class, or other sort of normal aberrant behavior you would see in kids. And the real sort of question of threat assessment work is, when is it not that? When is something getting more concerning? And it's, sort of putting in place the basic framework of what do you do in that situation if you're worried about it. You can look at a recent case that we just had in Michigan, the Oxford High School shooting that happened last fall. There was a lot of bad stuff going on with the kid who did that. Who's accused of doing that and charged with it now, right on down to drawing, graphic violence and help me, the thoughts won't stop, and things like that. And teachers saw it. They saw it and they reported it to counselors. And there was a meeting with the family. And, in that situation, a trained threat assessment team is going to have a codified set of actions to take, steps to take to...
Like what? I mean, because as a therapist myself who have been alerted by teachers and parents about kids like this.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think, well, if I call the MHPs, they're going to come in, the government mental health professionals, and do an assessment, and the kids, the individual in question, in all likelihood, is going to present with a not an imminent threat to self and others. And even if they did, it would just be 3 to 7 days in a hospital, and then they're out. And as you were saying earlier, that doesn't solve it necessarily. So what are you supposed to do as a therapist once you see someone that is flagged for this possible behavior, suicide or mass shooting?
Well, I think the question is a little bit different in the context of a private therapist relationship. But if you're talking about in a school, going back to the teacher question, if there's elevated concern, one of the first questions that will get asked is, does this person have a plan to commit violence? Are they thinking about it? Are they preparing for it? Do they have the means to do it? Do they have access to weapons? Those are all important immediate questions to answer. If the answer is no, as you're suggesting, then what do? Well, you're trying to get this person constructive help, and the at the heart of the work is diverting them onto a better path. If you think about what the field calls the pathway to violence, well, that takes time, that takes management. You have to have a plan in place for that. So what I observed at length in the Salem-Kaiser program is they will intervene with a set of individually tailored measures, get this kid into a different classroom situation where he's less worked up about the thing that he was really upset about. Maybe there's special education help, there's counseling going on. Maybe his home life is a mess, and let's get him into a church youth group activity that he likes. All of these things that are trying to create a better path for an individual, but at the same time are also allowing a threat assessment team to keep careful watch as well. Right. So that if that kid does start researching guns on the internet or try to go buy one, then you take the next step to prevent that.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. And it's just good practice that a lot of administrators and therapists and school psychologists and teachers will do anyway, not to necessarily reduce mass shootings, but just because they see a kid suffering, and so they're trying to help them.
Right.
And those things will obviously, if you have a program in place that does that sort of thing, 99 times, or I don't know, 999 times out of 1,000, it's going to be a kid that was never planning on doing a mass shooting. It was just a kid suffering. But you're going to catch those occasional people, because mass shootings are pretty rare. We hear about often when it happens, but in terms of the amount of people who fit the profile, who are suffering, who might even have thoughts of it, who actually do it, is, it's a pretty small minority of people who actually do it. But yeah, so, it's the same goes for suicide assessment. Do they have access to guns? Do they have anyone they can talk to? What's aggravating them that we could sort of reduce? All those things are important. And so the thing I'll say is that there are people already doing that sort of work, and some people have a more pointed program around that, but every school has someone who is trying to do that for their kids. And what it comes down to is tax dollars, because if you're the sole psychologist for 3 different schools, you do not have the time to spend on all the case management aspects of this. You got to reach out to the parents, you've got to follow up with them, and it all comes down to tax dollars. If we had more tax dollars to pay for these people to increase 5-10-fold, then you're going to have a lot more time to actually pay attention to these kinds of situations.
I think you've made a key distinction there too, because from the perspective of the threat assessment field, it's not up to an individual to do this work. It's collaborative team work and team resources. And that's important both in the way that you're describing, just the ability to handle it, but also in terms of bringing resources to bear and having collaborative judgment that comes from different perspectives. That's an important principle of the work too, because the real heart of the work, as you were suggesting, is figuring out is this person a real threat, a real danger? Lots of kids will mouth off or talk about guns or talk about Columbine, but does that mean that they're trying to become like a Columbine shooter? And assessing that is much more complicated and requires a certain degree of training and expertise. A good example, a story I tell in the book, is there's a high school kid named Brandon, a junior, who one day is overheard at the bus stop telling a friend that he's going to bring his dad's gun to school and shoot it up. And, was he joking? Was he serious? The kid he's talking to doesn't really know, but another kid hears it and is worried and tells a staff member, and it goes to the threat assessment team, and they start looking at the case to see, is this a real threat or not? And immediately they begin to find all kinds of other warning signs going on with this kid in terms of his violent ideation, his kind of personal deterioration. He's quit a club that he had really liked. He was doing more poorly in school. There were some things going on at home. So it's a matter of gathering all that information. You can't expect one school counselor to do that, both in terms of time and resources and expertise and training. So,
yeah, and on the flip side, because a lot of times these stories will come out and people will review the data, the school shooting you mentioned, that the teachers knew. They called the parents, and you look at that situation, you're just like, oh my God, like massive amounts of neglect. But what I'll say from the other side of the coin is, for every one person like that, there are thousands of other kids who show the exact same warning signs and nothing ever happens. And I can't tell you how many times schools or parents would come to me worrying about this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I would initially, in the beginning of my career, I'd get all worked up. But over time, you're like, oh, it's just another one of those kids who is, upset or likes to shock people or has little indications like they are drawing pictures of guns all the time. And there's this assumption from people a lot. So it can kind of go both ways. There's a lack of action often, but there's also like way too much reactivity from people sometimes,
Yep.
So I want people to know that when you see a case on the news and it looks like, how could you possibly ignore the warning signs? I want to alert everyone to the fact that for every one of those people, there's thousands of others who showed the exact same warning signs and nothing ever happened. And there was too much reactivity and stigmatization of a kid who just likes to draw pictures of guns, or he's just going through a phase or something. So,
and I think threat assessment leaders that I've spoken with will be the first to say, hindsight is 20/20. It's much easier to see this after the fact, even in a more extreme case like the one in Oxford High School last fall. But by the same token, when they do happen, it's hard to deny the clarity that always comes with every one of these cases after the fact, that you had this trail of behavioral warning signs and circumstances that are by and large detectable and recognizable to people who have studied this problem. And so therefore, if you have that expertise in place and the ability to manage it, you have a much better chance of blocking it from happening. And over the course of my reporting for Trigger Points over years, I was able to look deep inside a whole lot of cases like this, where you may not be able to say 100% for sure this person was going to commit a mass shooting, but when you look at the breadth of evidence, the planning, the ideation, the warning signs, you can say very confidently, this was a very dangerous situation, but for these interventions, this probably would have led to that. There have been many cases like that. We don't hear about them because it's not news when you stop violence, right? That doesn't make the 5 o'clock news. But I was fascinated to learn early on that there's quite a lot of cases like this throughout the country over the years that have happened. And I think also the other point you're making is really important too, that one thing I found in researching the history of this field that I thought was really interesting was that even early on, in some ways this was developed out of work to try to prevent assassination inside the Secret Service. This goes back to the 1980s, where some forensic psychologists began working with Secret Service agents to figure out what they could do more to try to identify who might be a threat to the president and other major figures. And through that years of research, learned a lot of things about this behavioral pathway we're talking about. But it was clear early on that the collaboration to identify and evaluate threats was important. And then fast forward to the era we know as sort of post-Columbine, the school shootings era. Of course, they were happening long before Columbine, but that's sort of how we think about it today. This was all sort of brought into the world of education and developed for education with the Safe School Initiative was a landmark research study on that, and developing this for use in the education setting. Same thing, people who were developing this, including the folks at Salem Kaiser that I talked about earlier in Oregon, right after Columbine, I think somewhat intuitively gravitated toward multidisciplinary collaboration between mental health, law enforcement, education professionals, and others are working with county agencies, juvenile justice system, so that you can bring together all these perspectives on a case of a kid who is saying things about bringing a gun to school. Well, is that just noise like it often is, or is it a real threat? And it's much more effective to figure that out with people together who bring this different perspectives to the equation and have experience and training with it. So I just thought it was really interesting that, this came up as this field kind of developed organically over decades in multiple settings. This is how it was done. It was never up to one person to figure it out.
Hey, deserving listeners, as you all know, I am constantly recommending that people go to therapy. We all need therapy from time to time. Well, one of the options available that is definitely worth checking out is BetterHelp. If you're looking for a therapist, I would give it a try by going to betterhelp.com/Kirk. Make sure you use the promo code Kirk because you get 10% off your first month, and it really helps us out. As you watch these videos, I know many of you have been motivated to find your own therapist, which is great because you deserve it. And I know also that it can be hard to find a good fit, find the right one for you. Well, one of the options available in terms of your shopping is to go to betterhelp.com/Kirk. I've been told you can start communicating with your therapist in under 24 hours. You can message your counselor at any time. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions. I've also been told that it's often less expensive than in-person therapy, and you should know that this service is available to clients worldwide. So go to betterhelp.com/Kirk to get 10% off your first month today. Yeah, before we started recording, you were mentioning that this was related to the attempted assassination or the assassination of John Lennon, and also, I'm guessing, the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, which happened pretty quickly together. And the news coming out about the individuals who committed those crimes, you start to see these parallels, Catcher in the Rye, possible psychosis in those situations, delusions. But anyway, so when I think about kids and this, as you're talking, I think, well, it dovetails very easily into our push to reduce suicide among teenagers.
Yes.
And it all the same things are there in terms of threat assessment and reduction of risk factors, guns, that kind of thing, and reaching out to them, trying to help them, trying to make them feel understood, reducing bullying that they're experiencing, all the things that we would do that, because for every mass shooter, like I said, there are thousands of kids who kill themselves or attempt to kill themselves and don't go on a mass shooting spree, but the motivation might be coming from a very similar place, if not the same place, right? Because I've heard of kids I've heard of adults and kids who will kill themselves and will do it very vindictively. They'll have a lot of rage towards others as they're doing it. So it's very similar in that way.
Absolutely. That was something that I learned a lot about in the course of reporting and researching for trigger points, was that kind of thin line between suicidality and homicidality. And obviously that is clearly what's happening in many of these mass shooting cases. And so I think in the context of a threat case, when you have someone who's showing signs of suicidal intention, and there's some threatening behavior going on that suggests homicidal intention, that escalates the danger level a lot for practitioners. They get much more urgent about the situation, even if it's more about suicide, because For example, one way of looking at this that I learned about at a threat assessment program in Colorado is they would often ask the question of a kid showing suicidal ideation. They would ask the question from a threat assessment perspective, well, where are you thinking about committing suicide? And if the answer was in a public place, at school or elsewhere, that was very concerning, right? What's to stop them from pointing the gun at somebody else before they point it at themselves?
Right.
And that comes up in a lot of cases.
Well, and it exhibits a public desire regarding their suicide, which is not typical. Typically, suicide is something that people want to do, right, behind closed doors. They don't want anyone else there. But
to your question earlier of the increase, that's something that has come up more. I write about that in the book too, specifically in the context of Oregon, that there are more kids who have attempted to or committed suicide at schools in recent years. And we also know there's a rising rate of suicide among youth, and that may speak to the question of trend in mass shootings as well.
And alienation, and that's just my thing, is the loneliness that people are experiencing is on the rise, and that's something that we can try to roll back. The difficult thing, though, that I'm thinking about is if we go to adults, the ability to detect and intervene sharply drops off. Because, when you have a 17-year-old, they're in school, they are under the thumb of their parents, they can't legally move out. You have a 45-year-old gambler who is losing his money in Vegas all the time, and he gets divorced and he isolates, and over the span of a decade, he slowly develops this plan to kill a bunch of people. And if he's particularly good at hiding things and not talking about things, you wouldn't know anything. There would be no warning signs. Right. Of course, there are cases where adults will give warning signs, but there are, and perhaps that's, well, what is it? Is your sense that most adults do have similar trails that can be identified online and the way that they talk?
The short answer is yes, but it is a broad continuum. And you're right that detecting this in people, adults or otherwise, who are not within the confines of a school or an institution, it gets harder. So that general distinction between school and adult community threat assessment, yes, there are other challenges there. But I think where threat assessment work has made a lot of inroads and seeks to is in workplace settings. Workplace violence is a major part of this as well. I mean, we look at all of the mass shootings in places of where people were employed or formerly employed. That is a majority of these cases as well. And in those contexts, you're talking about a pretty similar model where you would have people around that person who are worried or maybe freaked out. Instead of telling a school counselor, you're talking about maybe telling an HR manager.
But what power do they have? They can't force the individual to do things the way you can a 17-year-old.
Right. Although, can you force a 17-year-old to do things is a question too, right?
Well, believe me, that's a viable question. Yeah. But at the same time, I'm just trying to imagine what an HR person is supposed to, you're at a large corporation, Microsoft or something, and you go to HR and you're just like, so I got this coworker that is doing, the following things. Like, what is the HR person supposed to do, and what can they do legally?
Yeah. Well, I think that speaks to the question of evaluating the situation. And what's interesting in part with this too, is that in many, if not most of these cases, the threat assessment professionals are going to go directly to the subject and talk to them. Hey, what's going on? We're concerned about you. We've been getting some reports that you're making some people feel upset, and we want to help you. We want to figure out what's going on here. What's wrong? How can we help you? Right. That speaks to the constructive nature of the work.
Have you heard of that working? Because as a therapist who has been asked to do things, there were times when I would be called upon to do that. They're not necessarily homicidal intent, but someone would be exhibiting behavior in a social setting at work or at school, and they would say, can you go to that because as a therapist, people come to me. They want therapy, so it's not frequent that I'm going to someone else. And I'll tell you that, well, I guess when I think about it, it's sort of mixed results, that sometimes it works and the person opens up and talks with me, but there's a good amount of times where they're just like, who the hell are you? Like, get away from me. Stop trying to get in my head. What is this? What's going on here?
Right. It's not necessarily about giving them therapy in that moment. It's more about, sort of a practical threat management scenario, like trying to, or not, maybe it's not even a threat. Maybe it's just a matter of assessing what's going on here that is causing disruption and trying to alleviate that. Right. And to answer your question, yes, there are many cases like this that I have looked at and talked to people about who have handled these cases where, and I write about some of them in Trigger Points. There's a case of a guy who was working at a fuel company who was threatening to bring a gun to work, or had recently bought a gun and was upset about the way the business was kind of going and was worried he was going to get laid off. And the company went to him with some help, some people in the FBI who were doing this work. And they weren't involved in the intervention. They were advising the company on how to take a threat assessment approach. And they went to him and basically said, we want to help you out, and we're going to ask you to go and get some help. And if you can do this, you can come back and have your job. And so basically it was a favorable kind of administrative leave scenario. The guy went and did it, came back and was very thankful for what the company had done for him. There are a number of examples like this that I've seen, both in school settings and in workplace settings. So is it always going to work that way? Of course not. And you're going to have tough cases where you just can't get someone to respond. And then it's more a matter of, from the perspective of threat management, how do you handle this? How do you manage this? Even if you're going to send somebody away out the door, you're going to fire them ultimately because it's not tenable to keep them around. There are ways in which you can do that may be more safe than others, right?
Like what?
Well, for example, make sure that you don't humiliate this person publicly. Do it quietly and try to do it in a way that helps them what the field calls a soft landing, right? If you create more anger and grievance in a person who's already on that path, you may be accelerating the problem. You may be signing up for them to come back and shoot up the place. There's a case like this in 2015 in Roanoke, Virginia, that's very well known. The guy who was an ex-TV journalist who shot his former colleagues on live television. I don't know if you recall that case.
I do. God.
And he had been fired.
He was live streaming it on Facebook, wasn't he?
So 2 years before that happened, he had been fired very kind of unceremoniously from the TV station and kind of marched out the door. And I don't think that, if you looked at that from the perspective of this work, that was a very good way to do it. I think it deepened his grievance and obsession with the employer that he then targeted 2 years later by going after employees. And they were specific people that he had beefs with. But the point here is, that's a case where you're probably not going to get them to play along and do well and come back and be a healthy, productive employee. But then the question is, how do you manage the threatening situation in a way that is also going to have the best outcome?
Yeah, I think that's rough. That's a hard one because the inherent nature of being fired is humiliating and upsetting to begin with. There's no way to soften that landing. Now you can mitigate things by not adding to the firing, by publicly humiliating or just sending them a note and saying, pack your bags, see ya. There's a compassionate way of communicating it to, but in some ways you just can't win. I've had to fire people myself. I've been the boss at times. I don't like it, to tell you the truth, but I don't like being boss. Part of it, I don't like firing people. And there are situations where you do everything you can to be super cool about it, and they're still super pissed at you. You know what I mean? So that's a tough position to put an organization into. Definitely
tough. I would agree, or can be. I think going back to the example I was describing, the case from Trigger Points about the fuel company employee a number of years ago. I think, in looking at that case and in interviewing people who handled that case, I came away with the sense that part of what happened was the company really made him feel like they cared about his situation in how they engineered his exit. At first, getting him help, he came back, there were some more problems, and then they basically said, we can't keep going, we have to let this person go. But by the time they were doing that, the person was essentially thanking them. I mean, I'm sure he wasn't happy about being fired, but he did say something to the effect of, I know what I was doing here that was wrong, and I appreciate that, when I was really in a dark time, that you tried to help me. And I was quite surprised to see that. And they did some practical things to help him too, like they gave him some severance, and they said, we're not going to stand in the way of you collecting unemployment insurance, in terms of how they engineered the departure. So all of this taken together, from what I could see, was a way of making that person who was in crisis or angry, or however you might describe it, making that person feel like they were somebody that they were prepared for. And is that always going to work? No. But the alternative is, if you don't do that, are you increasing the danger to the workplace?
Right. And not only mesh or, someone coming back and shooting up your workplace, but I think much more likely is just ill will towards your corporation, which you don't want, particularly on a day, in today's social media world.
This guy actually, in this case, literally said, I have no bad feelings for you, on his way out. I thought that was quite remarkable.
Yeah. Which is like, treating people like human beings. Who would have thought?
Yeah.
So another aspect of this is the last question I'll ask, is we haven't talked about things like schizophrenia, delusional, psychosis. We haven't talked about psychopathy, or what the internet will call sociopathy, antisocial personality. People will say, well, isn't that a factor? Because aren't there cases where someone's delusional and they think they have to kill a bunch of people to save the world, or they're a psychopath and they don't care about other human beings? Isn't that the genesis of this kind of behavior? Do you get into that in your book?
Absolutely. And there's a clear answer to it. It's a very small subset of the problem. And there is some very important specific research on this, some of which is pretty recent. There's a team at the FBI in the behavioral analysis unit that does this work.
Mindhunters, the TV show.
So actually it comes out of that. And I write about this in the book. In fact, the chapter on this specifically on this in the book is called The New Mindhunters, because the work they're doing is a little different. The famous Mindhunters were doing retrospective criminal profiling, right? They were trying to build from a crime scene an identity of, who committed this horrible crime, and let's go find them and track them down. But what these new mind hunters do that I write about in Trigger Points with threat assessment is they're really researching and tracing the profile of this behavior, as we talked about earlier. How, let's do everything we can to understand what leads up to these acts, and therefore we can detect it better, right? And so in developing that case research, mental illness is a very important point of inquiry. It's a huge myth around this problem that we talked about earlier. And what the BAU research team did with this, they published a big study in, I believe it was 2018, that looked at more than 60 active shooter cases over the period of a decade plus. And within that set of perpetrators, it was less than 5% who had psychosis. And it was only a minority subset that had diagnosable mental illness of any kind in a clinical sense.
Which is similar to rates among the general population, maybe a little bit more. So it's a slight, tiny little factor.
But I think the distinction that's so important here for the general public, because these definitions can get very thorny, right, or difficult to sort of parse. The distinction here is, as you say, it's not. Most of these people are not people who are hearing voices, hallucinating, think that they're being told by aliens to go commit a mass shooting. That kind of psychosis is a very small subset in these cases. Most of these people are angry and have deep grievances, and they're depressed, and they may be suicidal, and they've developed an idea that they want to go out and commit violence as a solution to their anger or despair, that's their way out, whether it's revenge or even just relief, right? So it really needs to be understood from that perspective. If we want to think about the warning signs, that's what we're looking for. We're not looking for people who are hallucinating about aliens. That's very rare in the data sets of mass shootings. And this FBI research documented that even more than it had been before. And the research that underpins that, as you were saying earlier, goes back a long way. That violent mental illness is not predictive of violence, right? That it's a very small correlation and it's not meaningful in that way.
Right. I mean, my memory of doing a deep dive on the research is that the vast majority of people with psychosis don't commit any kind of violent crime, and the vast majority of violent criminals do not suffer from delusions. So associating those two things is ridiculous given the science. But having a mental illness like this, severe mental illness is what we would call it, psychosis, does increase the risk slightly. There's not an association. There is a slight association, but to marry the two things is statistically silly.
Well, I think one of the problems that we have with this problem culturally and perhaps politically is that we repeat that myth when it's the most dramatic moment or the most high-profile traumatic cases that happen, right? There's a big mass shooting, and then a political figure or a president says mental illness pulled the trigger.
Right.
And that's how everyone remembers this problem. And there are cases where psychopathy or psychosis may have been a factor in a major mass shooting, but then that creates a sort of outsized perception of that being the problem. And then we repeat it over and over in the way we discuss the problem publicly. Yeah,
it's even more ridiculous, like the New Haven kid.
Or you mean Newtown, right?
Oh, Newtown. What did I say? New Haven? Newtown.
Sandy Hook perpetrator.
Sandy Hook, right. That he reportedly had autism, and the story, the headline was autistic kid kills a bunch of people. And it's like, what?
I was just going to bring that up. I think that was incredibly damaging after Sandy Hook, the way that autism was discussed in the media and publicly as a cause, right? Which is, there's just no evidence at all to support that.
But when you look at his life, he was isolated. He felt very alone. He had reportedly years, or at least months, of descending into isolation and anger and depression and hatred and rage, completely independent of his autism, because, again, the vast majority of people who are autistic don't do anything like that. So, but the other thing I want to ask about is psychopathy, is this notion of having no remorse and perhaps sadistic psychopathy that either you're born with it or you develop it. We don't really know, but there are people who just have no remorse. They don't care about other human beings. They don't care. They're callous. And do you write about that in your book?
Yeah, that is a factor that comes up in cases, but again, it's a very small subset of these cases. And in those situations, I think then you're talking more about it from a threat management perspective. You're talking about institutionalization or, criminal prosecution in some of these cases. These aren't people who are going to be responsive to extracurricular programming or, counseling per se. So yes, that is there. But I think what you were just alluding to before about the Sandy Hook case, there is actually there is research into that case that happened much later by threat assessment researchers that posits that he had psychopathy among a constellation of serious behavioral and mental health problems, right? And circumstantial problems with his home life. I mean, that case was a real shit show. I don't know if I can use profanity on this podcast, but I think it applies there. I mean, he had all kinds of serious problems. It was very complex. And so whether or not he was on the autism spectrum, they talk about this in the research paper that would be one of multiple comorbid factors that you would look at from an evaluation perspective, but that's not causal, right? Nor is psychopathy, though that is something that does exist in these cases. So you do have to ask the question, well, what is the role of it, and how would you contend with it if it's there, right?
Yeah, I mean, my gauge of the research is similar to psychosis, which is with psychopathy, it can play a role for sure. I mean, if you're upset and rageful and you have some intent of suicide or some intent on getting back at the world, and you have no remorse for other human beings, then it'll add to the potentiality of you committing that act. Whereas if you have all those factors and you aren't a psychopath and you do have remorse and you do have empathy for other human beings, so that could be a protective factor to prevent you from doing that. But just being a psychopath doesn't mean you're going to do that, and doing it doesn't mean that you're a psychopath. It's just like a tiny little push in the overall motivation to do this sort of thing. Because what most people say, including my co-host Umberto, is like, in order to do these kinds of acts, you must be a psychopath. There's just no way a human being could do these kinds of killings without having some problem with their brain that prevents them from having empathy for other people. And I keep telling people that's not the case, so what's your take on that?
Exactly. Well, as I was saying earlier, that not only is that wrong, it's incredibly counterproductive. It misunderstands the problem, and it has us looking in the wrong places for the problem. If everyone who does these attacks is totally insane or psycho, as we like to say in sort of, lay general terms culturally, we're not going to see this problem for what it is. And I say at the outset of Trigger Points that really what I came to learn very quickly in looking into this field of work is that the people who commit these crimes, who commit these attacks, are much more like you and me in their life circumstances and difficulties and in their human capacity to act violently than we wish to admit.
That's what I've been hammering on after looking into these cases over the last number of years. But how do you convince the listeners right now of that? Because I find whenever I say this to people, they're like, but me and everyone around me, we could never do anything. They must be from another planet. Those mass shooters, there must be something deeply different about their brain, because how could you do that? I could never do that. The people around me could never do that. What would you say to them?
Well, it's true that most people won't do that, but most people, all people in a sense, have the capacity to do that, right? So then the question becomes, what is it that leads a person to do that? What leads them to cross these kind of barriers or norms that we have where most people won't do that, where it seems completely unrelatable to us, that we can't imagine doing that. And I think, that's what I found so compelling about learning about the field of threat assessment, is that it kind of sets aside the sort of emotional, political, cultural constructs that we have about a problem like this and says, let's look at the behavior and the circumstances. And through that lens, we can see the patterns of what leads to this. And people will do this. And so under what circumstances and how do they do it? And if we can answer that, the better we can answer that, the better chance we have for stepping in with effective intervention. Yeah. So I think, this also relates to the idea that you often see in media coverage after a major mass shooting. You'll see the same theme over and over, where they'll interview someone who was close to the person, and that person will say, oh my gosh, I never could have imagined this guy would have done this. Like, he was never like this. This is totally different. I don't recognize this person, right? And that reinforces this idea that you have to be some other psycho alien to even possibly approach doing this. But then when you go back and look at the behavior and the circumstances and the experience and the buildup, the progression or the escalation along this pathway to violence, you see very recognizable patterns, quotidian things, right? This person got fired. They were really pissed off. No one would listen to them. Then they got divorced. Now they're using drugs, whatever. There's a whole constellation of factors that are going into the way they're behaving and the way they're experiencing the world. And they may start to develop this idea, well, this is my only way out. Or I'm so angry, I'm just going to take it. You're coming, I'm taking you out with me. That's a rational thought process in the sense that if you're seeking relief desperately or conclusion desperately in that way, you would think about doing something like this.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I have concluded, which is very upsetting, is that almost anyone could do this sort of thing, and it's not like we're one step away from doing these kinds of things. As you've been pointing out repeatedly, there's many steps. There's a road that people go down, and at the very end of that long road is a mass shooting. It's not typically just like it goes from one day where they're not going to do it and the next day they are. And so it's not like that, but any one of us could go down that road is the thing. Any one of us could have demoralizing experiences, perhaps trauma related as well, a whole lifetime of things that happen to us and little decisions we make along the way and little influences we have that can lead us down that road that are completely independent of psychosis or psychopathy. Of course, those can play a role, but any one of us, the nicest person on the planet, given the right circumstances, is given the opportunity to make decisions internally to go down that road. Because I don't know about you, but for me, I've had flashes of fantasies of, not mass shooting, of course, but like, I don't know, just like when you're angry, you just want to do something to the world, like you get frustrated. And of course, it's just a fantasy or a fleeting daydream of, I keep coming back to, Thanos and snapping. It's like, I just want to snap my fingers and have Putin disappear or something. There's just this feeling of wanting to do that. Of course, that's very normal. And I'll have clients tell me about these kinds of fantasies, and I've come to learn that they're really quite normal. And they'll say to me, "Is there something wrong with me?" And I'm like, "No, people just don't Instagram about these fantasies. They're very human, very very normal." But so I think some of us are in denial of those fantasies, and maybe some people don't have those fantasies, but many people do. And I think part of the reason why we want to have, well, they're crazy or this sort of thing, is because we want something to hold on to so that we can go to sleep at night, instead of recognizing the reality, which is that anyone, including people very close to you that are good people and nice people and loving people, could do something like this. Yeah. It's very upsetting to people, right? Do you run into that when you're talking to people?
Yeah, but I think, again, it goes to really sort of a fundamental misunderstanding. And for me, I came to feel over time in investigating this problem and this solution to it, that I see it as a very sort of optimistic conclusion in a way, because you do see in many of these cases also evidence that people who do this, they don't want to do it. They're ambivalent about doing it. They want help. These are, what we call the cries for help, right? Again, especially in a youth setting, but in adult settings too. So I think, from my perspective, recognizing that many people or most or all people are capable of this theoretically is a way of also acknowledging that people can be helped. All people can be helped. Almost all people can be helped, right? Yeah. You might have the psychopath who you can't help, but that is very exceptional.
But even the psychopaths, I've treated psychopaths who, they don't care about other people's emotions, other people's lives, but the vast majority of psychopaths don't want to murder anyone. And so you can actually help them to not do that, at the very least, so that their lives aren't impacted by the negative consequences of committing murder. You know what I mean? The
other way that I sort of came to see this, I think, more broadly, was through watching the work of threat assessment leaders. That it occurred to me at some point along the way that, like, what they're doing is very optimistic in a certain sense, right? It's this idea that, these are people who are very devoted to this idea of prevention of violence, which is not an easy thing to do. And they're not typically people who care to be known about for that, or like they're not looking for spotlight, and like they're doing this work. And I found myself thinking, like, why do they do this? Or what kind of person does this work, right? What kind of interest does it take to do this? And fundamentally, and especially in a law enforcement setting, I remember learning initially about this at the FBI and thinking, like, wow, the FBI is investing in a team of people who are trying to do like constructive mental health interventions. Like, what is that? That this is a law enforcement agency that's trying to, protect national security and solve violent crime and conspiracy and all that. So the people I got to know doing the work and just seeing in them this strong commitment to the idea that most people can be helped who are headed down this path. They can be turned away from this path. And then seeing the empirical evidence of that through many different kinds of cases, I find very uplifting. I think it's a really hopeful prospect that we could be doing more of nationally as a solution, an additive solution to this problem. No matter how you feel about guns and gun control and gun violence, that's here, that's what we live with. And so here's another way that we can really go after this, that, the public doesn't know about as much, but I think should know a lot more about. Yeah.
And it's going to catch a lot more people who are just suffering in general, who deserve to be paid attention to. But yeah, I agree. I'm completely that way as well, that to me, it's more optimistic. It's like, once you get over the shock, I guess, of discarding the myth that these are aliens, then, and that can be scary because of what I was saying earlier, but it actually means that they are like you in that, in the way you are convincible and malleable and care about other human beings and don't want to do that. This person also has a part of them that doesn't want to do it. You know, Darth Vader has good in him, sort of. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about was machine learning and Facebook and Twitter, and how I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they have programs that are trying to catch these kinds of patterns and alerting the authorities, do they not?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's an important question about this field of work. You know, one of the concerns about it, or the pushback it gets, is the risk to civil liberties. And it's really important, of course, to do this in a way that's ethical and legal. And it's not in all of the reporting I've done on it, I've never encountered threat assessment work that uses kind of like broad dragnet surveillance of social media or otherwise. Like,
but it's public behavior.
Well, I think the other way to think about it is that it's that in and of itself isn't really, as far as I know, a productive way to identify someone who's at risk for this, but it is something that you would look for in a person who is causing concern in other ways or has become the subject of a threat case. That's not to say that could never exist. I think that's possible, and we may see it going forward as tech.
It seems like it would be totally likely, you know, because
it's tricky too, though, right? Because then we're talking about like Minority Report type stuff where you're trying to predict who, you know.
Yeah, well, you're not going to lock someone up, but it would be people to reach out to this individual and be like, hey.
I do write about this in the book too, toward the end, how social media in particular has become a much more important element in threat cases, both from the perspective of the behavior that people show who may be turning dangerous in this way, and also as a tool of evaluation that is really essential at this point. But it's not, it's understood in the field that you can't rely on that heavily or too heavily, that you have to still look at this whole picture of a person's behaviors and circumstances. You know, they may be posting stuff on social media that on its face looks really worrisome, like their collection of guns or whatever. But then when you take a closer look at what's going on, turns out there's no threat there at all, that there's a completely benign explanation. There are cases like that too that I talk about in the book, a workplace one where a guy was like leaving pictures of guns on his desk, and he was kind of a weird antisocial guy, and like coworkers were getting worried about him. And the threat assessment team that looked at him, and they basically went and talked to him at his house and saw, oh, he's got like a happy family, his wife and kid, and like he's got a collection of guns in the basement that he likes to collect antique firearms. And he was printing out pictures of weird guns from his computer and leaving them on his desk, but and maybe, you know, didn't have a lot of friends at work, but that doesn't mean that he was going to go commit a mass shooting, right? So that shows you the limitations of what we can do with social media too. I think that's important in thinking about how we approach this, right?
Yeah. What is the name of your book as we close this episode out? Tell us the name of your book, and where can they find it?
The book's called Trigger Points: Inside the Mission to Stop Mass Shootings in America. It's publishing on April 5th from HarperCollins. You can go to hc.com/triggerpoints. You can Google trigger points and mass shootings, and you'll find it that way. I'm on Twitter at Mark Follman, actively there. I'll be talking more about the book there in the weeks to come. And yeah, I'm excited for this to go live in the world and have people read it. I think there's a lot that people will find in it that is helpful to understanding this problem better, and is also hopeful about what we can do about it beyond the sort of familiar political debates that we tend to get stuck in.
Yeah, I mean, your book could literally save people's lives.
I hope so. That would be amazing, right? Like to know it was a very gratifying project for me to work on, because you know, I was really drawn to this subject as optimistic and solution oriented in its sort of core, and that to be able to bring that to the subject of something so heavy and daunting in our society, that I think so many people feel like, oh, there's just nothing we can really do about this. It's just going to keep happening. We're just sort of resigned to it, but we don't have to be. And I think if the book changes people's minds in that way and helps them to see this in a different light that's more constructive, then I'm thrilled. That's all an author could ever ask for, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, Mark. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.